Welcome back to Pathfinders, a podcast series from RBC Capital Markets where we explore the fast-moving world of biotech and pharma. I'm your host, Joe Coletti. We're on location at RBC's Global Healthcare Conference in New York, and today I'm speaking with Chris Sims, Chief Commercial and Business Officer at 4D Molecular Therapeutics. 4D is advancing next-generation AAV genetic medicines for retinal diseases, including wet AMD and diabetic macular edema. As the company moves through phase 3 and prepares for potential commercialization, Chris brings a commercial perspective on how innovation reaches patients, physicians, and markets. Chris, welcome to the podcast.
It's great to be here, Joe. Good morning.
Chris, I want to start by talking about your background in ophthalmology and retina. What brought you to 4D at this stage of the company's growth?
So I have been in commercial leadership roles in ophthalmology and more specifically in the retina side of ophthalmology for nearly 14 years now. Years ago, I worked on a leading anti-VEGF brand called Lucentis that was marketed by Genentech Roche. I also then spent time following Genentech at Novartis. I launched a drug called BioView in the US. Following that, I made a departure from large pharma and spent time in a smaller biotech called Iveric Bio, where we had a phase 3 asset at the time for geographic atrophy. Had the good fortune of launching that medicine for GA patients in the US, and we ultimately were acquired by Astellas, which brings me to 4DMT. I joined 4DMT in 2024, so nearly a couple of years ago. And I was attracted to 4D by the opportunity that I believe to make a paradigm-shifting change for the treatment of retinal diseases. This entire space has great medicines that are highly efficacious, but they're all bolus in nature, and most of the innovation has been incremental extensions in durability. So you take an 8-week medicine and you extend it out by a couple of weeks from a patient durability perspective. And 4D has the promise and the potential, we believe, to make a paradigm shift for patients in the treatment burden. So instead of an incremental advancement in durability by a couple of weeks, which has been meaningful, we think we can actually reshape the entire treatment paradigm and potentially bring a treatment to patients that extends durability for months or years for many patients. And we actually think for some patients, and we've seen this in our phase 2 clinical data, patients that were getting upwards of 10 injections on average in a year got one injection of 4D-150, and now, a couple of years later, they are injection free. So that's exciting. It's paradigm shifting, and the promise of that was certainly attractive to me to be a part of something that I think could make an indelible dent on this disease and really create a massive benefit for physicians and their patients.
That sounds very promising, and I know retina has seen major therapeutic innovation over the past 2 decades, and you mentioned the treatment burdens and the persistent challenge there. I wondered if you could elaborate a little bit. You talked a little bit about this, but what else is still not working kind of well enough, particularly for patients and caregivers and practitioners today?
Yeah, I think when you think about how these treatments have been administered, so the introduction of anti-VEGF therapy for retinal diseases happened about 2006. So, we're almost 20 years beyond that time point. And these medicines are highly efficacious, but they're delivered through an intravitreal injection. So in other words, it's a needle in the eye, right? And they work really well. Patients, upon administration, certainly for wet AMD, they gain 5 to 10 letters of vision, which is incredibly meaningful. However, they have to come back on some frequency to get re-injected. So that injection in the eye has to happen at a frequency that's somewhat personalized to the patient. Some are it's as frequent as every 4 weeks. Some get extended out and they're on a 8, 12, or a 16-week schedule. But regardless of that, they have to come back at some frequency to get retreated. That results in treatment burden. And when you think about it, certainly from a wet AMD patient perspective, these patients are typically older. Many of them are in their 80s. Burden of getting into the clinic, of having a caregiver bring them, the recovery time post-treatment, all of that adds up. And unfortunately, that treatment burden over time can mean that many patients either cease taking therapy altogether, their frequency of treatment starts to wane. And those effects we've seen in real-world data will result in patients' vision starting to erode. So it's kind of unfortunate. You get this gain in vision upon initiation of therapy, which is life-changing, But then because of the treatment burden, you often get patients losing that vision when they get 1, 2, or 3 years out. So despite taking highly efficacious medicines, their vision is lost. We believe that if you have a 4D-150-like product on board, which is constantly expressing an anti-VEGF therapy, it's always there, it's transduced retinal cells, and it's producing the medicine the patient needs on an ongoing basis. Not only do you make a massive impact on the treatment burden reduction, right? You also have the potential for patients to hold on to that vision that they gain initially upon going onto therapy. So clearly, I'm sure you can appreciate from a patient perspective, that's life-changing.
So when you specifically look at wet AMD and DME, what makes those markets such a compelling opportunity for the next generation of these therapies?
The markets are really well established. We believe globally in our launch window horizon, the total value of the anti-VEGF market globally is probably going to be in the range of $20 billion. And that's grown fairly consistently. One of the reasons for that growth is one, there's been a continuation of innovation, right? So you've seen new brands come to market with the benefit of incremental durability. But you also have an aging and growing patient population. So age-related macular degeneration, by definition, it's a disease that presents more in the elderly population. And as we know, just from demographics, that population continues to grow as people age. So the market is projected to grow, we think, at a 3+% range for the foreseeable future. And the business model and the modality of treatment is fairly well established. So there's a lot of things that are known. Large market, highly diagnosed patient population, high propensity to treat this disease, and a market that's growing. The market opportunity, the attractiveness is driven by the need, as we talked about earlier, to reduce the treatment burden. So that's where we fit in, and our value proposition is very differentiated.
Durability is such a major focus across the category. Commercially, what does it take to sort of shift the physician and patient thinking when it comes to the repeat injections to longer duration disease control?
There's great analogs to that question. So again, we've seen new therapies come to market. The most recent has been a medicine by the name of Vabysmo, which is marketed by Roche Genentech, and Eylea HD, or high dose, which is Regeneron's follow-on to their Eylea franchise. And the benefit of both of those newer medicines has been an increment in durability. So again, I think about 40 to 45% of patients on Vabysmo in their clinical studies were able to get out to 16 weeks, and some are at 12 and some are at 8. So the growth has been driven by that incremental advancement in durability. And we know that's important. I mean, we see the uptake of these medicines. I think Vabysmo is on pace to be a $4 to $5 billion drug for Roche this year. And again, reminder, the benefit of the medicine is an extra week and a half to 2 weeks, maybe in aggregate data. And yet commercially, it's been a success like that. So our simple view of the world is if a week or two of added durability can have that level of commercial success, what's the potential for a medicine that can actually create durability measured by months and we think years for some patients? So that's the foundation for our business case.
I want to talk about 4D-150 a little further. Two-part question. You're operating in a very competitive environment right now. How is 4D-150 differentiating itself? And second, 4D-150 has the potential to be a global product. How are you thinking about the launch strategy across key markets?
Yeah, great. So let me first talk about the differentiation of 4D-150, then I'll go into the global opportunity and how we've thought that through. So the differentiation starts with our science. So the key hurdle with any gene therapy, certainly in ocular gene therapy, is that physicians and thereby patients have to have a strong belief in its safety profile. You need to demonstrate safety before you earn the right to talk about efficacy. And we think our safety is grounded in the fact that the company took the time well before I showed up to innovate and be very thoughtful as to how they selected and designed the vector. So at the core of 4D-150 is something we call the R100 vector. The R100 vector was raised and selected in a non-human primate model versus other therapies that often are developed in a mice model. So we think that matters because it most resembles a human. And it was selected through a directed evolution process that we think allows it to be more targeted to the retinal cells that it has to transduce, and then by definition, not transduce other cells that it should not be acting in. And when you can do that in a highly targeted way, one, we think we can deliver a lower dose. So our dose is 3E10, which is lower than other programs that are in development. And we think that has an implication for safety. So that's, a high-level overview as to the R100 science. But as importantly, we've generated, we think, pretty robust clinical data through our phase 1/2 program on 4D-150. And our scientific thesis seems to be playing out in the clinic, where we see in-clinic trial safety data that resembles standard of care. And the big thing in this space is the rate of intraocular inflammation. You don't want anything that's in the severe category, and the overall rate, physicians would tell you, should be similar to what they see in standard of care. And that's what we've demonstrated. We think our most differentiating element of 4D-150 is our safety profile, where we've shown IOI rates that are similar to what you would expect with Eylea. So that's important. From a global perspective, to the second part of your question, we think the unmet patient need is a global unmet patient need. In fact, when you think about the benefit of 4D-150, which is hopefully a safe, efficacious therapy that's constantly on board, there's certain countries around the world where access to care is not as easy as it is in the US. So if you have countries where maybe patients can only get to see a retina doctor once or twice a year, having a therapy that's always there, that's always providing coverage, could actually be more meaningful than in countries where you can actually get in to see a doctor more frequently. So we believe that it's a global opportunity. Certainly the US is the largest and most valuable market, but we've designed our program for global application. So Forefront 1, our first phase 3 trial, has completed enrollment as of the end of March. That's a North American trial. 90% of the sites are in the US, the balance are in Canada. Forefront 2 is a global trial that we have US sites, but we also have sites in Europe, South America, and Asia Pacific as well. And it's for that global opportunity that we reference. We do believe there's a market globally for this asset. And in fact, we announced last year, we already have interest. We've signed and agreed to provide Otsuka, a Japanese pharmaceutical company, with Asia Pacific rights for 4D-150. So they've been licensed for that market, but we retain the rights for every other market, excluding Asia Pacific.
What do retina specialists need to see before they're going to be comfortable adopting like a new treatment paradigm?
Well, obviously, first you need to see safety, but you need to see that in a phase 3 setting. So we're looking forward to the first half of next year is when we'll read out our first phase 3 trial, Forefront 1. And then shortly thereafter, approximately 6 months or so in the second half, we'll have our second phase 3 readout in Forefront 2. So that data is going to be really important to the retina community. And then beyond that, once you get into a commercialized setting, I think they need to see a couple of things. They're going to need to see the demonstration of efficacy in the real world. And clearly, to the conversation, they're going to be looking in the real world for two things. They're going to be looking for safety. They're going to want to see that safety in the real world reflects what we hopefully show in our phase 3 trial. And they're going to be looking out of the gate to how the medicine performs in the hardest to treat patients. Every new medicine that's been launched in this therapeutic area, the Vabysmo, Eylea HD, a few years ago when I launched it, first gets used in the patients that have the highest treatment need. Those that are getting injected 10, 11, 12 times a year. That's your first test. We feel really good about our odds in that test because we've generated data already in our phase 2 program with patients that look exactly like that. So we're confident that that real world test, 4D-150, would show up really well and create a meaningful treatment burden reduction. But those are the two things out of the gate that physicians are going to look for. And then, of course, there's a bunch of non-clinical things around confidence in reimbursement and so on that we'll have to work through. Luckily, I've spent most of the last 10 years of my career working on things to help with that.
I'm glad you mentioned that. You've helped commercialize major retina and ophthalmology products in the past. What lessons from those launches in particular do you think are most relevant to you as 4D moves closer to potential commercialization now?
Yeah, I think every launch is different. It's a dynamic marketplace. So ultimately, how you think about launch got to be a reflection of what you're trying to accomplish in the market that you're looking to enter. But there's a couple of common things that I think are worth kind of always keeping in mind. First is start early, right? These things take time, and I don't think any launch that's been successful anyone's ever looked back and said, oh, we started too early. So start as early as you can, start as early as financially your company is able to provide support. And then I think work closely with the retina community. We're so fortunate to work with a retina physician community that's highly engaged. They want to see advancements in science for their patients. And they're open to working with you early on. We've often had this philosophy of work with retina, for retina, by retina is a tagline we've often used in a commercial strategy, which is, work with these physicians and their practice managers. They'll give you great insights. They'll help you understand what's important to their patients and incorporate that learning as you're preparing for commercialization, and it won't steer you wrong.
So I have one last question for you before you let you go off to your investor meetings at the conference today. When you look ahead, what do you think will define success for the next generation of retina therapies, and how is 4D really preparing for that future?
Yeah, I love that question. We have a vision for 4D-150 to be what we call a backbone therapy for retina. And that simply means that we think the majority of patients should have a safe, efficacious therapy always on board to treat their disease. The disease doesn't take a day off, and so we don't believe your therapy should take a day off either. So we're excited about a future treatment paradigm where the vast majority of patients have a 4D-150 on board, providing safe, efficacious treatment of their disease 24 hours a day, 7 days a week for the rest of their lives. And then for patients that need supplemental therapy, because it's a heterogeneous and very dynamic disease, some patients need supplementation occasionally. Doctors and their patients have a lot of really good options to choose from that are bolus in nature to provide that supplementation. So our vision is in the future that this disease is treated for the majority of patients with that backbone therapy approach, where patients are provided with constant coverage. And we hope for the majority of patients that treatment of 4D-150 will be the last needle in their eye that they'll ever need.
Chris, it's been a pleasure having you on the podcast. Really insightful conversation, and we really wish you and 4D best of luck as you work through the phase 3 trials and hopefully move into commercialization.
Thanks, Joe. It's great to be here. Thanks for the invitation.
Thanks for listening to Pathfinders and Biopharma, brought to you by RBC Capital Markets. Please remember to subscribe to get more great content and be alerted about future episodes. This episode was recorded on May 19th, 2026. If you'd like to learn more or continue the conversation, please contact your RBC representative or visit rbccm.com/biopharma. See you all next time.
This content is based on information available at the time it was recorded and is for informational purposes only. It is not an offer to buy or sell or a solicitation, and no recommendations are implied. It is outside the scope of this communication to consider whether it is suitable for you and your financial objectives.